So, my name is Salve Nilsen. I am the current chairman of the Norwegian chapter of the Internet Society. We are happy to have a really awesome cooperation today to bring you some interesting conversations and to introduce you to today's events and schedule. I would like to introduce Steinar Grøtterød, who is one of our board members and one of the persons who have really made stuff happen for us. Steinar.
That was very close to the first accident there anyway. But let's hope that goes. First of all, ISOC Norway is extremely pleased to have this workshop together with and listening now, because this is one of the few seldom times I'm saying the correct name of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Just make a mark on that, ICANN. And together with the Norwegian Association of Law and IT, and we are also very proud to have our sponsors, ICANN and IQ. So a big applause to them. Thank you very much. Before I start this event, I have to do. I have to make some sort of administrative. So, first of all, this event is live streamed and recorded. So whatever you do, it's been there forever. It will be there forever. The presentations will be published on ISOC.no. There you will find a link when you address that page. And between the three slots, there will be some short breaks, because you have to make the speakers then mic'd up and do some technical stuff. So that's something that you have to be aware of. There will be a short break, but we will be in this room, and after this event, we will have some refreshment. You're looking behind you, and there is a bar, and we will serve you some nice stuff. So, the first slot is an introduction to ICANN, and you remember what it stands for now. Everybody, we do a test. It's held by Christopher Mondini. Christopher Mondini is Vice President, Stakeholder Engagement, Europe, and Managing Director for Europe, and he's based in Brussels. So a great welcome to you, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. I just do the rest of them, and then we go into it. The second slot is about cybersecurity and EU's NIS2 directive. This is, in my view, extremely interesting, because it's something that will most likely infect one way or another the business we're in on the internet. The speakers here are Lise Fuhr, and she is Director General, European Telecom Network Operations Association, also known as ETNO, but it's not ET.NO, it's ETNO. Elena Plexida, she is ICANN Vice President for Government and IQ Engagement. And we have Håkon Styri, who is a Senior Advisor at the Norwegian National Security Authority, in Norwegian called NSM. For this slot, we have Tobias to be a moderator, but where is Tobias? Good question. He's coming? Okay, that's good. Tobias is a Norwegian, he is employed by the Norwegian Research Center for Computer and Law at University in Oslo. Then, the last session, and we have a short break, you remember that, is about DNS abuse. And we are pleased to have the following speakers. Cian Lloyd from ICANN, he is the Lead Security, Stability and Resiliency Specialist. Hilde Thune, who is a Managing Director of NORID, which is the registry operator for .no. And we have Rolf Larsen, who is the Chairman for IQ Global AS. This session will be moderated by Sebastian Felix Schwemer, who is Associated Professor / Head of Center for Information and Innovation Law, something that I can't pronounce in English, UCP. That means something in Copenhagen, doesn't it? Yes, very close to it. Okay, so I'm definitely looking forward to this. It's one of the biggest events ever taken place by ICANN Norway. So let's hope that we manage to do this in a full and a good scale. Welcome to the stage, Chris, and take your word. Thank you.
A very quick notice, by the way. We have a recording of the room sound also, so if we can be very quiet, it would be awesome for the recording on the stream. Thank you.
My goodness, I feel a little bit like I'm on a karaoke stage. But luckily for you, it's not a karaoke stage. I'm very grateful to be here. I just want to say, so many of you have done so much work to set this up, and we've had a very warm welcome from a number of Internet stakeholders across Norway, of course the Internet Society and our Global IQ, the fellow partners, the academic community, government stakeholders here in Norway, NORAD, and others. And so I'm very grateful. We're very happy and proud to have a partnership with you here. And I did also want to especially say thank you to Steinar for being a driving force for all of this. And I did promise also for those of you that are already members of the Internet Society of Norway that you must consider joining the board. I promise to help recruit for the board of the Internet Society of Norway, and it will be a very valuable experience, and we do so. My name is Chris Mondini. I sit in Brussels organizing the European region for Internet, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is ICANN, of course. We will know it by the end of the presentation. And I've been with ICANN for about 10 years. I started out in the United States working in the California office. At one point there was a Silicon Valley office. And then through the headquarters in Los Angeles, because if anybody asks where the Internet was born, a good answer is Los Angeles. And I had a career in diplomacy and a career in technology consulting before that, but I'm really happy to be using my technology regulatory skills for the good of an expanding global Internet. When I give a talk, I really usually always start out by saying, though we call it the Internet, it is of course a network of networks, and these are independently owned and operated networks that choose to interconnect voluntarily because they use common systems, common standards, common protocols, and among the most important of these, the one that the originators of the Internet struggled but could not succeed in making completely decentralized is the addressing system, or the system of unique identifiers, as we call them. So again, in that name, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, you have the two big categories of these identifiers. The numeric addresses that identify parts of the network or devices. We're up to many tens of billions of devices connected now. And of course, the systems that convert to domain names, which are largely what we as humans can remember and use to navigate the Internet. And when you think that there are tens of billions of devices, and in the last 10 years that I worked at ICANN, we've gone from 3.5 billion Internet users to about 5.5 billion Internet users. It's quite an amazing and incredible success story for the system that so many of you here have worked in for many, many years, and many of you depend on. I was chatting with a few of you before the event, and you come from sectors like construction or sectors like maritime, shipping and software, and you're all here because you know that every sector now is depending on these systems that keep the Internet global, expanding, interoperable, and we all depend on it. So, the ICANN organization that I'm part of is about 400 people. We're in about 38 countries, and I would say our main focus is the administration and the operation of a domain name system, this addressing system that I discussed, with a lot of important technical partners, regional partners like the RIPE NCC partners like NORAD and others. It's a distributed network of partners that make that happen. We are also very involved in convening a community. And so you'll hear this distinction between the ICANN organization for which I work as a paid employee and the ICANN community. And the community, it's around about, we tried to quantify about 10,000 people who have passed through policymaking at one point or another at ICANN, from business, civil society, government, academia, internet users, all in different structures that meet to make policies. And when I say policies, I like to think of them as innovations and developments in these systems, these addressing systems, because they're not static. They have to evolve to meet the needs of the world and the internet users. So we have this administrative technical operations function. We have this convening a global community. Every country in the world, 180 plus of them are represented on the governmental advisory committee alone, from all those stakeholder categories that I mentioned. And then at the same time, we're spending increasing time really responding to what some of the risks are. And of course, we're hearing about them. We'll be hearing from some of my colleagues and some of the people that Steiner introduced about abusive practices on the internet, and several projects to address that. And also monitoring well-meaning, well-intentioned legislation or regulatory activity that can inadvertently have an effect on how these underlying systems work. But the fun, exciting, innovative part of what we're working on really is in what this community produces, what it puts out. So in the coming months, you'll see a further expansion of what's called the generic top-level domain space. So these are sitting alongside the well-known country code top-level domains, and have it in 2012 was the last time there was a big expansion to now more than, I think, 1,500. So in earlier days when there was a .net or a .com, these are now joined by .coffee, .guru, .xyz, etc. And finding ways to make these registries available for those that would like to have a community or a presence on the internet is something we're working very hard on, and that we as an organization are convening the community in making real. The most exciting part of that, though, I think, is in what is a very, I would say, inspiring, almost heartwarming part of the work, which is in internationalized domain names. So if you can imagine that in parts of the world which use different alphabets or scripts, even today, an internet user needs to find a keyboard that will have a www dot and Latin script. And if you're the next billion users and you're speaking in Devanagari or Arabic, or you use a Cyrillic alphabet, if you're sitting in Chennai or Hokkaido, you don't want to have to do that anymore. And what's amazing is that all of the volunteer efforts of many people across our community, linguists, technical experts, they get together and they make what will be the future internet, which people will be able to experience 100% in their own language, in their own alphabet. And of course, all of the software systems need to be compatible with these new names. And so there's a big effort across the community and a great deal of investment, in fact, in what we call universal acceptance, which is going to talk to everyone. I've been to headquarters in Silicon Valley companies with a colleague from India, and we showed on a device, we said, look, there are 250 million people that have these domains in this particular script, but yet when they try to sign up for your transportation service, unnamed transportation service, they can't do it, and that gets their attention. So it's very inspiring work because it really is about really continuing on the mission of the growing interoperable internet. We had some progress that the community has made that was announced just in the coming days about ways to comply with data protection laws, which involve deciding how to have a system, a pilot system, to make the unpublic portion of data that you might provide when you register a domain name available to certain approved requesters of this data. And so this has been really an arduous task among all of those stakeholder groups that I mentioned to comply with a lot of data protection regulations around the world. And again, it's important work, and it's all in the service of keeping the internet expanding and keeping it growing in the service of users. The Global South, I talked about the linguistic aspect of it, but there is, of course, the technological and network aspect of it. We've worked with the Internet Society to encourage the installation of internet exchange points in Africa, for example. These are places where these networks that I described come together and where the boundary lines where the data gets exchanged. As ICANN, we manage something called a root server instance, a network of root servers, which are, I would say, the servers where the queries that your devices make to find out how to navigate the internet visit, and we've put a cluster of them in Nairobi recently, with another one to come elsewhere in Africa. And immediately we saw that the responsiveness and the resiliency and the patterns of the traffic improved to be closer to the user, to be faster, and again to make the internet work better and be more meaningful for all of those that are joining it every day. A couple of the topics today that will be addressed is one that I alluded to, which is some of the regulatory aspects where sometimes in the current geopolitical climate, I would say, well-meaning, well-intentioned legislative or governmental initiatives sometimes can have unintended effects on what happens in this technical layer of the internet. Elena Plexida, as my colleague, will be addressing that with her fellow panelists. And then I did allude to, I would say, abusive practices, both, I would say, the systems themselves and how they can be attacked, but also how the domain name system can be used to do other things. I mean, the domain name system really helps us to do everything, but when it helps people to do things like distribute phishing or malware, this is an area that we are seeking to increase knowledge and capacity and awareness among all of us who have a stake in mitigating those harms. So, in addition to recruiting for the Norway ISOC board, I'm also recruiting for ICANN. But the good thing is, I described this community, and you might say, well, who is in this community? And the secret is, you're already in the community. If you're using the internet, if you're depending upon it, you are part of the community, because what you do depends on the work of the many volunteers, and many of you have already volunteered many hours of your time to keep the internet and the domain name system and the unique identifiers upon which it works running. But you don't have to develop lots of hours. There are many easy ways to follow. You could do as little as signing up for a newsletter. We have a fantastic mailing list, email list that Gabby Shitek organizes, and Gabby is there in the back in a red outfit, so you can all find her and all find ways to get connected with her email address and email list. And that is where we publicize our regular monthly webinars for the Nordic region on all kinds of topics, including topics that many of you propose. We convene this global community 3 times a year in a live, free, open meeting, and it's pre-pandemic. It was between 2,000 and 3,000 people, and I think we're quickly getting back to that size of meeting again from 160 plus countries, governments, business, civil society, domain name sector actors. The next one is next week. It's in sunny Cancun, but who needs Cancun when you have the sunshine here in Oslo, which I've been enjoying greatly. We have one in Washington, D.C. in June. And then in Hamburg, if you'd like to attend one a little bit closer, there's one in Hamburg. It's the 3rd week of October. And you'll be able to see this community in action. And if you really want to dive in and sign up for a policy development work, or if you just want to join one of the structures of the community to be on an email list, or, as I said, a newsletter and email list, you can be that very cool person in your organization that knows all about ICANN, and people go to and say, could you explain that to me? You can be that person. We have papers that we publish on governmental issues, on regulatory issues. We have excellent papers that our Office of the CTO publishes, because I've met many academics here. And then finally, I just want to say, ISOC Norway is also what's called an at-large structure of ICANN. So this is a grouping of internet users that come and give the user perspective on all of these issues that I've addressed. And so when you're signing up with Salve and Steinar, you're also signing up with ICANN at-large structure. They are organized also on a European regional basis, and they run all kinds of awareness raising and educational programs. So that's my recruitment speech, but as I said, I feel we've already recruited you. I am here with my colleagues to help you to get as involved as you would like to be, to answer all of your questions, but really most sincerely to thank you and all of the internet community here for the warm welcome, the open dialogue, and the awareness raising that you're such a good partner in. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grace. We do have some opening for some questions, so anyone that wants to know about some acronyms? This is a decent audience. Yeah. So, as a thanks for your coming here, and you're going to a very warm and hot place. We're going to give you these. Well, I don't know the English word for that. It's
Norwegian.
yeah. So you have to promise me when you're on the board, and I will watch you, that you have to bring this one on and make a mark.
Yeah. I will represent you well.
Thank you.
So we are ready to continue. And we are shifting a little bit of focus. We are shifting the focus on cybersecurity. And as you will know, the internet wasn't really designed to be secure, but cybersecurity has become an issue over time and is increasingly in the focus of both ICANN and other organizations. And by other organizations, we can perhaps also include the European Union, where there is regulatory effort going on to ensure cybersecurity. And I think it's interesting to have this double perspective on both ICANN and as a global organization and the European Union as a regional organization, but also the different modes of regulation where you have traditional governmental organizations and then this multi-stakeholder perspectives meeting each other. And so for that we have convened an excellent panel to talk about cybersecurity and the EU's NIS2 directive, and we'll hear in a few moments what NIS2 is all about. And the first person to speak about this is Lise Fuhr, who is Director General of the European Telecommunications Network Operators Association, also called ETNO. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I will bring not only the internet perspective, but of course the telco perspective, because I work for the telecom operators. And as you might, I don't know if you know ETNO, but just very briefly, ETNO are a European trade association, and we represent 70% of the investment in infrastructure in Europe. So my members are big telcos like Deutsche Telekom, British Telecom, but also Telenor, TDC in Denmark, Telia in Sweden. We are having members in all European countries, and of course, as telecom operators, we're also subject to cyber attacks because, of course, a huge part of the critical infrastructure is telecommunication, and we do exchange a huge amount of data. So the internet runs on the telecom infrastructure. But as I would like to discuss with you before we go into NIS2, what we see is that cybersecurity and cyber threats have to create regulation and measures to reduce vulnerability and also increase the resilience of critical entities. So I know not everyone is happy for the NIS2 directive, and of course NIS2 is not perfect, but to me I think it's an important part of regulation. I think it has the goal of achieving a high level of cybersecurity across the EU member states. We had the first NIS directive that showed to be difficult to implement, creating even more fragmentation than was meant, and actually the enforcement of it was a bit difficult. So now we see a new directive which is strengthening the security requirements, also trying to address the security of the supply chain, and streamline incident reporting obligations in all membership countries. We will also see there are much more stringent supervisory measures and stricter enforcement requirements. This is not to stand alone. We will also have the directive on resilience of critical infrastructure coming up. So there are a lot of regulation on cybersecurity coming up in the EU. If we look at the legislative process, you can see the timeline here. I'm not going to go into depth with this one. The slides will be available for you if you want to look at them after this presentation. This is originally a 30-minute presentation that I'm boiling down to 10 minutes because we want to have a conversation with the panelists. So, well, if we look at what's happening now, we have a directive, but that directive needs to be implemented in the member states. So it's not a done deal now. Now the national authorities need to transpose it into national laws by October 2024. So that will need to be done. We'll see that ENISA, the European Cyber Agency, will also have guidelines that they will publish. And also the Commission will have the Delegated and Implementing Act, and this is important especially for TLDs and DNS services that will be specified in an implemented act. If we look at the NIS2, I'm not going to talk to all of these things on the slide, but very quickly, there will be an improved cooperation at EU level. We need to increase the trust between the competent authorities. They need to work more together. We need to facilitate information sharing between the competent authorities, and also there will be rules on how to handle large-scale incidents or crises. There needs to be stronger security requirements, but also the stronger enforcement and supervision, including harmonized sanctions for breaching of the directive. Today it's a bit more, as I said, fragmented in each member state. So NIS2 is also reaching many more industries. Before, so that's one of the massive novelties of this directive, is that it's actually expanding the scope of who is included under regulation. It extends the scope to new sectors such as telecom, social media platforms, and also public administration. Plus, as I said before, the registries and DNS services. So, if we look at the risk management measures, well, concretely, the regulated entities will need to implement a number of cybersecurity risk management measures as part of their security policies, but also practices. And you can see this long list. Many of the registries, but also of the telecom operators, are already doing this today. So it's not like it's a huge shift. I think the biggest thing here is the reporting measures. So actually that we need to report. So if I look at the reporting obligations, well, when there is an incident of significant impact, you need to report it. And how do you define significant impact? That is to be seen, but it's more if it stops the services that you're providing, or if it has a huge economic impact on your company, then you'll need to report it. Also, the cross-border reporting is important. If you have an incident that is affecting more countries, you will need to report it to, of course, the member states that's affected, but also to ENISA. So there is things that needs to be taken into account. You need to have a response plan. You need to know what to do if you have a cybersecurity incident. And again, as I'm saying, many of you already do it today. Many of the companies that are affected by, that are using the internet or having critical services, of course, you know how to deal with cybersecurity. If we look at the telecom operators, we don't see this as a revolution. We see this as an evolution, because we're already working with many of these measures. Many of the countries, many of the member states already had rules that are in the NIS2 directive in place for the telecom operators. I come from Denmark. I know DK Hostmaster had requirements to actually comply with ISO 27001, and so therefore much of what's in the NIS2 is already taken care of there. But what we see as a development is also that it's widening the scope, so the full value chain is in focus here. And I think the value chain is important for all of us, not only telcos, also for other internet players. And if I look at the internet infrastructure, as I said, this regulation is very explicitly regulating the TLDs and the DNS servers, even the non-European registries that are offering services within Europe. As I said also before, is the key aspect is the ICT supply chain. That's extremely important for resilience of critical infrastructure, because what we see is that some of the breaches are made in the ICT supply chain. So the vendors also have their role to play. And here, if we look at NIS2, it might have a greater focus on the supply chain, but it doesn't really cover all of it. So we had hoped that NIS2 would cover everything, also the supply chain, but it doesn't. Of course, there are coordination with the vendors, and the vendors their products are partly defined by the services you want them to provide in the hardware and the software. But if we look at how the world develops right now, 5G, 6G is moving into softwareization. It's much more virtualization of the networks, and the more virtual the networks becomes, the more vulnerable it becomes to attacks too. Of course, we see 5G as more secure than 4G, but we also know that the surfaces where attacks can happen becomes bigger. So there is a balance to be taken care of there, and we need to make sure that everyone who are delivering software, hardware, whatever, to telcos are also needs to comply with NIS2. So this was raised with the Commission. So now the Commission have the Cyber Resilience Act, where they say, well, this will actually also cover many of the providers of the vendors of the software and also the hardware. We see it as partly, but in the Cyber Resilience Act, what we see is that it takes into account that it needs to be security by design. We need to have lifecycle support and update, and also there are some requests for vulnerability handling processes. But how it's gonna be brought to life is still a question. The rules are not, the act is not decided. There's still negotiations going on in the EU. Plus, in the end, it's all about how it's implemented in each member state. So that was a quick introduction to NIS2, but also the Cyber Resilience Act. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So maybe we can then have the panel on the stage here, and Lise, if you want to end your presentation there. So we are now joined also by Elena Plexida, who is the Vice President of ICANN for Government and IGO Engagement, and also Håkon Styri, who is a Senior Advisor for the Norwegian National Security Authority. And what we have in the plan for the next minutes is that both Elena and Håkon will give initial presentations on their perspectives, and then we can have discussions. But perhaps before going to the first presentation by Elena, let me check if there are any questions to Lise's perspective. And you won't be able to ask the questions now, but just to check who has questions. We have one question there. Two. Okay, excellent. 3. 4. Excellent. Good. Then we have 4 questions in line for you later. But first we go to Elena. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lise. I'm very grateful to Lise actually, because she did a very thorough explanation of what is NIS2 about. So now I can jump right into the effects, if you will, and really from the internet side. And when I say internet, for us, ICANN and the family of technical organizations that we do this work, so the RIPes and the IPFs, internet is really the fundamentals, right? The unique identifiers and the IP protocols that help them come all together. So when I say internet, always I refer to the fundamentals. Right, so what would the effect of NIS2 legislation be on this side? And I mean from a security standpoint. So NIS2 is all about bringing in more security. What would that be? There is no question as to the fact that the DNS is critical. Of course, it's absolutely critical, no doubt to that. As Lise said, the cybersecurity risk management measures that are laid down in NIS2 are nothing crazy, apparently. Any operator in the space that actually respects itself already does it in one way or another. Or anyway, if the operators do respect themselves, they will be doing it. So if there are any operators out there that do not respect themselves, then maybe you can say that through the legislation they will have to implement these measures now. So in that regard, yes, maybe we will see a more secure space. I would rather like to focus though on the scope of application of those measures and the obligations. On the scope and the approach. Initially, and I'm sorry that I will take this dive in the past, but it's important. Initially, as the NIS2 proposal came out, it was envisaged that it would include DNS operators all the way to the root servers and the root of the internet. The root server operators are 13 around the world. 2 of them are in Europe. They have hundreds of instances that all they do is they propagate, they publish for the rest of the world the root. So then our queries get resolved fast and securely and resiliently. That's the idea. Okay, so the EU proposed that it would impose regulation on all of them, be it in Europe or outside Europe. Okay? Bear in mind that these operators offer their services voluntarily for the public interest, for the sake of the world. So, exposing these operators in regulation and in fines that NIS2 also includes would probably have had the bad outcome of making them withdraw from the service. At some point during the negotiations, the Council had realized that this is not the way to go, so a compromise that they were thinking, I'm just saying this for the sake of the argument, a compromise that they were considering was, let's put a threshold and see if you have more than 10 mirrors in Europe, then you will be in regulation. If not, you would not be. But what would have been the effect of that one? Everyone would have dropped to 10 instances so as not to be in the regulation. What I'm trying to say here is that what would have happened if this would have been in the regulation is that we would have had less of these mirrors. The whole reason that the domain name system is secure and resilient is that we have many of those. So in that respect, NIS2 would have had the exact opposite outcome of what the intended outcome was. So in this space, less is less secure. For the rest of the DNS operators, there has been an effort to actually put in scope those that make sense, but I have to say that still there are lots of them that by no way are critical and still are in scope. Anyway, why am I bothering you with the root server operators which are now edited out of NIS2? The reason I'm still raising with you is the approach to security. So we see, because of what Lise mentioned at the beginning, so there are very real problems that I have to say they're on the internet, and the fundamentals are there to give you the glue to have a global internet. Everything else comes on top, and up there we have many issues and security issues. But because of this, we see legislators around the world, not only in Europe, but Europe, if you will, is the leader there, thinking about, okay, how am I going to make it that more secure? What am I going to do for my citizens? Which is, of course, a rational consideration, right? In Europe, we have the principle of digital sovereignty that we are upholding. What we're seeing is that digital sovereignty is applied the same way it is applied in cables or it's applied in software, all the way on applications overall, all the way down to the fundamentals of the internet. And the point I'm trying to raise here with you is if you want it to be more secure, you have to do the exact opposite. You don't do this when it comes to the fundamentals, because then you make it less secure. You create one single point of failure in all these things. You have to think in the exact opposite way of when you think about other kind of things, like securing products, for example. So that's the reason I'm raising that here with you. We see that not only in NIS2, but here and there in other regulations that come from the European Commission. Another area where we see that is standardization. In different regulations, again, here and there, you see this approach coming into play. So we have to do our own. We have to put in place our own standards, and then the world will follow, which makes perfect sense for the single market. You have to have products in the single market that are secure. Absolutely fine. If this perception, this idea of doing standards, though, comes into our world, into the standards that the ITF is making, these things either are considered globally, agreed globally, and then they work globally, or you just have your own part of it. Bottom line, this approach, when it comes to the fundamentals, might at the end risk the very fabric, the glue that keeps the internet together, let alone its security. That's my initial comments.
Thank you very much, Elena. And let me check again. Do we have questions for Elena coming up later? One and a half. Okay, good. I also have a question. Excellent. Then we can continue with Håkon Styri.
Thank you. So, just to introduce myself, it's because being introduced as a senior advisor at the Norwegian National Security Authority is not what I'm really going to represent and talk about today. So I'll start 30 years ago when I started working at the Telenor, the Norwegian Telecom, before the deregulation, as a research scientist. I was more or less quickly known as a guy who talked about the internet being able to carry the entire communication services in the telecom network. So the bad scientist. Today, or these days, I'm talking about the danger of losing internet connection because it carries everything. So somehow, by luck, I was right about this projection. I was also lucky enough to be part of something called the Internet Telephony Consortium at MIT and Harvard University, where we actually modeled and made it actually prove that it was possible to have telephony and any kind of service carried by the internet. So that's been quite a fun story. So the NIS2 directive, to start where I got involved in that. In 2004, the European Union started a program called the European Program for Critical Infrastructure Protection, which then was proposed as a directive in 2006, and it was confirmed, it made a directive in 2008. In 2006, I started working with the working groups and expert groups in 2005 doing this, and when the proposed directive was published, it was 11 sectors that was critical infrastructure, and that number is quite important because the NIS2 directive have 11 sectors that are essential, and the CER directive, which is the resilience of critical entities, have 11 sectors that might be critical entities, so they kind of match up. But in that was not the case in 2008 because the proposal from the Commission was reduced to 2 sectors, which was energy and transport, and that's it. And the definition was, the threshold was quite high, so it was only services involving 2 or more member states, and it ended up with being really too strict. I joined an expert group for ICT, for information technology, trying to find out, can we join this FCIP directive with another sector? Quickly we found that nope. This was actually, we had, as Lise mentioned, we had most of this implemented already because the FCIP directive was very focused on incident response. Our sector was more focused on preventing incidents. So after a few years of discussing, ending up with suggesting things that made the European Commission create. First, they made a cybersecurity policy, and recently after that, it became a cybersecurity strategy in 2013, and then the work with the NIS directive, the first NIS directive, started. And that is now history. So, but it's kind of a good story because after working with the NIS directive and evaluating that, the NIS 2 directive picked up expanding, and it got a sibling, which is the resilience of critical entities. And these are really sibling directives. With the 0 directive, the resilience of critical entities is the non-cyber, and NIS 2 directive is the cyber. It's explicitly noted that both have a risk management approach for that is all hazards, which is for some of the cybersecurity people are working with intended threats only, and the NIS directive is all hazards. It's very important. And the NIS directive has a cooperation group. The same thing is for the resilience of critical entities. And both directives states that these two groups must have joint meeting every year. Any critical infrastructure that is pointed out in the resilience of critical entities directive is automatically inside pointed in the NIS directive. So the non-cyber directive makes new services entering the NIS directive, and that is disregarding size. This directive in most of the size it's larger than SMB businesses and public functions. And then some things are disregarding size, like DNS. So it's quite inclusive, and there are 2 directives, non-cyber, cyber, that is actually working in a pair. So note that these will work. In Norway, we have the legislation, the Civil Protection Act. They implemented the FCIP directive in 2012, I think. Yes, 2012. So that directive have been implemented and will now be replaced by the resilience of critical entities directive at some stage. But this will happen in concert with this directive because they are like this. And the Civil Protection Act is the Directorate of Civil Protection, who is the authority of that act. So we need actually, in implementing these directives in Norway, we need that the several authorities will have to cooperate for making this really happen in the organized manner it should happen. Also, we have a third directive, which is the third act, which is DORA, which is the financial sector. So it's a trinity of 2 directives and 1 act, but especially this NIS directive and the resilience of critical entities are really joined together. Though preventive security measures are more or less included in risk management, the risk management activity. And the risk management activity is defined somewhat differently in the Resilience of Critical Entities Act and the NIS the Resilience of Critical Entities Directive and the NIS Directive, but it's fairly compatible. Both directives will have a form of they are specifying a format for strategies, so we will have to have the cyber security strategy with in performance with the NIS Directive article, what is it? 3, I think. And the same with the Resilience of Critical Entities Directive will demands that we have a critical infrastructure strategy. So, and they are quite similar. So we will have a new strategy, a national strategy. Lise covered most of the things here. So going into details, I should mention that incident response is quite important. If you read the recital, that incident response takes priority for reporting. So if the incident response activity is critical, you can leave the reporting until you actually can manage to do this. So it's very important that there are quite a few details in the recital that you should read and understand. There have been lots of changes in the NIS2 directive since it was proposed. So one of them is supply chain risk management is also included, but that is for European Union critical entities. But still, Lise, you have the diagram of the 2020 telecom incident report, which actually was a format I was happy enough to define, be part of the group who defined this report in 2012. It was a long report, 10 years of reporting. In 2021, they actually reported that the third-party root cause, that is root cause in the supply chain, was about 19% of the incidents. Compared with the IBM cost of a data breach report last year, they report about 21% is supply chain root cause. So it's 1/5 of every 1 of 5 incidents seems to be had a cause in the supply chain, and that's quite a lot. So, well, I should add also that the Cyber Resilience Act, which is coming, it's still in discussion. The committee in the European Parliament has not made a report yet, but it's stated that it probably will cover about 10% of products. So 90% of products will not be covered by the detailed requirements in that act. But this will be quite a good set of regulation that will improve security. So I think that probably is enough. So yeah, 10 minutes.
Excellent, Håkon, thank you very much. And this means that we can now start discussing, both in terms of discussions amongst panelists, but also with the audience. And perhaps I can start with some of the questions that were formulated in your minds after Lise's presentation. Can we start with some of these? I saw some hands.
I go first. Oh no.
Yes. We have people on Zoom, I think, so.
I'm so sorry about what I'm about to ask. You can see I'm young, inexperienced. Usually don't do much in the realm of security. Mainly a question to both, really, and as Lise was talking, to Lise as well. Thanks for a great presentation. A lot of interesting stuff. I'm learning at breakneck speeds. Be patient with me. The internet is a global thing, right? It's a global corporation. There are a lot of voluntary actors in here. Security, traditionally a national subject, right? the EU typically, traditionally, hasn't been very involved in matters of national security, so there are some counterpoints as to why the EU should be regulating this, right? But what is the EU's stake in making this a directive and regulating it on an EU level? What's the interest and what's the driving force behind that particular work in a broad sense, is my question.
Perhaps all of the panelists can say something on this.
Yes.
Well,
Well, I can give it a first go, but much of the EU regulation is about creating a base level. So a level of security here is by harmonizing the countries. Telecom operators have been regulated by the EU for many, many years. Now what I see is that they want to create that baseline for the ecosystem as such. On the telco side, we have had specific regulation before we were in this involved. Now we are part of the NIS directive, NIS 2, but only in this second round. But there is still, and still have been for a long time, security regulation in the telecom regulation. I think you're right, it's a national matter, but now with the cybersecurity threat, it has become global or European.
I can just add on that the NIS directive is a minimum directive, so any member states can add on to whatever relation they feel is required. That is one aspect. The other aspect, which Lise mentioned, that is harmonization, that actually we use the same standards, we use the same language for describing risks, we use the same method of trying to express risk. And if you again read the recital, the directive preamble, you'll find that any questions regarding national security is exempt. So the member states will not have to reveal any national security information. The problem here is that because even if in Norway we have something called fundamental national functions that are covered by the National Security Act, so we will have to restrict the information about these entities, but we will have to report incidents if they are inside this directive for sharing information. So that is actually, it will be somewhat difficult to actually make this happen in all member states, because every member state has some small varieties of national security acts. So, but I think it's possible to work it out. And the important thing is information sharing, that we share information about incidents.
Thanks. Elena, you want to add something on that, or should we proceed to a question?
Let's proceed, I think.
Okay. There were some people also that wanted to ask a question regarding Elena's presentation. If we want to proceed there.
Come on, people! I already set the bar really low.
No, you didn't. It was a relevant question.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask a question about the first presenter instead, because this too has some varying aspects. I mean, I can't use the excuse of being a newbie. I'm on Harald Alvestrand, member of the ICANN board, and also an open source developer. So the NIS2 looks like it's trying to secure the supply chain by imposing restrictions and fines, and the possibility of fines all the way down the supply chain. How do you see the open source ecosystem operating in this environment?
Yeah, how do I see it? as I see it right now, NIS2 will not include the vendors. So that has been part of this. If you deliver an open source to a registry, the registry would be the ones who are in charge, and they would be liable if you, as an open source, if they're using your open source. So the open source under NIS2 might not be threatened. It could be under the Cyber Resilience Act, and I don't know how that will be end up being. And I do understand your concern on open source because that's done on a non-profit basis. But the bottom line of all of this is that when you use anything in commercial terms, you need to be responsible for what you do, and that doesn't foresee open source, and I don't know how that's actually taken in. Maybe you know more about where the open source lies in all of this.
Well, the supply chain part is apparently only the European critical entities, but still it is a problem really to open source responsibility, or actually to do this in a proper way, because lots of repositories are no longer maintained, and you might even not even know who took part in whatever actions that caused some vulnerability. So I don't know how they are actually going to implement this in a good manner regarding open source. But what is more important is that disclosure of vulnerabilities will be improved within this new directive. So that is a good thing. So that might be the counterweight, that because we have a more strict regulation on disclosing vulnerabilities, the responsibility of not disclosing the vulnerability is less of a problem, hopefully.
Just echo.
Yes,
Lise is right. In the CRA, there is this issue. I don't see it in NIS2 really, but in the CRA we do have this issue. Please.
I'm just curious if it has been raised during the consultation on the CRA, because I think that's an important point, saying you do have an ecosystem of open source and non-profit that has a different kind of value and also purpose that needs to be taken into account. But in the end, it also needs to be trustworthy. So how do you actually balance that?
On that, I'm not really sure it was raised in the thinking of the proposal, because as you know, sometimes you have a public consultation that doesn't really give you a very clear view of where things are going. But that said, our colleagues from ISOC looked into it and have seen a very comprehensive piece about that and the effects. Hope it will be taken into consideration as negotiations proceed.
Excellent. Did we have other questions for Elena?
Hi, my name is Nielsen. I'm the current president of Norway chapter of ISOC. I have a question for actually kind of more of all of you, and it's playing further on what Harald just asked here, and I would like to add a little bit of information which I hope will help add some weight to the issue. I've seen some numbers that in the European markets, 92% of all applications written use open source software as part of their supply chain, their dependencies. And I would like also to correct maybe or adjust some of your ideas on what we're talking about here. We're not talking about non-profits, we're talking about volunteer work. People who, in their own time, do something they love, and others find it useful and use it because it's been given away in a very beneficial term and an open source license. And for me, this sounds like we are about to introduce some regulation that will be frankly ignored. It will. There's a if 20% of all issues that are out there are related to supply chain issues, and 92% of those again are open source related. And who knows how many of them, these again are purely open, volunteer driven. Should we enforce people by knocking on people, these laws on the doors of their homes, or are we, should we have should we introduce some requirements to businesses that they take the liability of this, and in that case maybe force businesses to have an ongoing lively relationship with open source developers all over the world? What do you have any thoughts on this topic? I'd love to hear what you think.
I could supplement your numbers that an estimate is that 3/4 of the code existing overall is open source. One thing is vulnerabilities and liabilities. Another thing is licensing, because there are quite a few issues where people, open source groups or publishers, authors have a license on their open source code, and it's not used as it's supposed to be in the license. So there are some quite extensive analysis being done here. The notion of proprietary software that is written in-house, every line of code is very rare. There is some code that's written this way, it's very little. So I think if the legislators are not observing the reality that the map and the terrain is not I think they're in for a surprise. So.
Before we continue with Lise, am I understanding the question correctly? That so Elena, you're saying that the issue is not with the NIS2, but with the Cyber Resilience Act proposal. And what part of the Cyber Resilience Act proposal is the specific challenge to open source?
I have to say, to start with a disclaimer, this is really my turf. My turf
Okay.
is the fundamentals. And I, surprisingly, still have a life, so I don't remember the particular articles. I don't know if...
No, I don't have the specific. It's more that we know that the Cyber Resilience Act is going to also include the vendors. But here, the vendors are seen as a commercial part. And I completely understand, and sorry for calling it non-profit, it's volunteer work, much of the open source. I think it's an interesting dilemma, because open source is an important part of our digital ecosystem today. But we also have cybersecurity, which is a basic threat to our lives if we don't take care of cybersecurity. So I'm not saying that open source should be held liable, but if you use open source code in commercial software, you need to be liable not as the open source developer, but those who are using it for commercial purposes. So to me, there is someone who benefits from open source in a commercial way. They need to be liable, because you sell people also a product that they need to trust.
Right. I guess we also need to continue the discussion on open source and Cyber Resilience Act when we have a more specific discussion of that act. But yes, follow up here.
Yeah, so Hans-Peter Holing from the Right NCC, and there was a question here of whether there had been any comments to the Cyber Resilience Act regarding the open source problems, and yes, there has. So Right NCC has submitted our comments on this, and we have consulted with our community, which has an open source working group, and several of these issues have been listed in that. So the Commission should know about this. I think there are also 2 or 3 other European responses that raise the same kind of issues. Just to add, I agree with Lise here that, yeah, well, somebody has to be responsible for providing a secure service, and if you use open source, I would think it's unreasonable to try to pass on the buck to the producer of open source. But then on the other hand, we use open source for DNS resolvers, which are volunteer or organizations, but we also use Red Hat Linux or things like that, where it's a huge commercial group back. So it's one size fits all doesn't really make sense here.
Thanks. Next question. Yes, Steiner.
Yeah, this is Steiner. I'm putting on my day job hat on, and this is somewhat connected to domain names and internet based on domain names. My reading of the NIS2 is that it will involve more entities than the NIS1 or the NIS directive. So we know that in Europe there are very many of the new generic TLDs are based in Europe because of tax reason regulations and etc. And they have to adopt the new directive whatsoever. The registrars has to do something, even though they are not ICANN accredited, maybe they are just national accredited, etc. The ISPs must do something. So my question is, what sort of revolution will come? Because there will be changes. How much will that affect the business? Will it actually be feasible for the entities that today are in operation? Will there be entities that are saying, no, I can't do this anymore because they're too strict and the fees are too high. I can't risk it. I'm turning down the business. Something actually I read from ISOC in a report based in set in 2021. But anyway, I don't think that is completely valid. But my question is, what you're thinking about how much will this kind of change the business of registry operators, registrars, ISPs, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, I can take that, and others might want to complement. It is true, it is very different compared to NIS 1 in the sense that NIS 1 already included DNS operators, but it was up to the EU member states to look into their jurisdiction and say, okay, we think that this is essential, but this is not essential. Now, for the sake of harmonization, and because different member states did very different things when it comes to the domain name system operators, automatically, if you're a DNS operator, no matter what, you are essential. Which as I was saying before, it does make sense in some regard because yes, DNS is super essential, but in another regard, it does capture entities that by no means are neither essential nor important. So yes, for those operators, it's probably going to be an extra burden to go through, as I was saying before, basic cybersecurity measures everyone should be doing. The reporting obligations, though, are coming on top of that. And what you mentioned is the key here. Similarly with the GDPR, what was the issue that made the GDPR so big? The fines. Here the same. So maybe for small operators that are not critical and not important, can be an operational burden. I don't know about that, I'm not sure.
I think the burden is going to be bigger, of course, on all the small ones, but also on the cyber agencies around in Europe, because they need to actually get all the reportings. They need to supervise and also look into compliance, etc. There's going to be heaps of issues on getting this system up and running, but I think in the long run, it will make it better, and I hope it will find a balance where it's not overly burdensome, but more at a level where we are creating more trust in our digital ecosystems.
And that Lise is very much correct. I'm very sorry to interrupt. Just to give you a sense of the size and scope, there are millions of domain names registered only in Europe, and the authorities will supposedly have to be receiving reporting from all of them. Sorry to interrupt.
So yes, this will be exciting to see how this is going to be handled. But still, the threshold of requirement of how severe incidents should be reported and how much risk management and how many security measures are they being imposed on these DNS. That will be, of course, very important, because if the cooperation group and ENISA and the European Commission is raising the bar at the reasonable level, the threshold is not too low, it probably will work out. If they are too strict, you have to report small incidents, do a lot of risk management and having lots of security measures implemented, it will break down. It will be too much. Some of these details in the directive have not been worked out. They are to be decided later, which is also the resilience of critical entities directive. The list of what services, what functions are included will be decided by the European Commission in November this year. So the list is not, it doesn't exist of what services are going to be ruling what is critical infrastructure regarding that non-cyber directive. So we have to see how the coordination group, how they are deciding things. I hope they are reasonable. So.
One last question there.
So I was actually going to ask the same question as Salve before, but when I'm sitting here, I'm getting a completely new question arising, and I'm not particularly familiar with this regulation. What I have done is I've been working on the DSA regulation and the CISA regulation. And what I'm hearing here is one of the problems that I'm worried about, actually. There doesn't seem to be some overarching, comprehensive thoughts going into this. It seems to be some siloed approach. So a lot of entities are going to fall under several regulations. And I realized I'm probably going to send a question to you that might result in some just throwing your hands up in the air and wondering, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you see, how do you see all these regulations coming in together and not necessarily being coordinated? How do we approach this?
How do we approach this?
Very easy question. How do we approach this? What I can say is that I know that the member states are at least at some extent aware of that, because in particular when it comes to the NIS2 debates, at first they spend a lot of time thinking about that. How does GDPR come in? How does the one come in? How does the other come in? I don't know to what extent they were very successful, but there is some level of awareness, that's my point. How do we approach that? We're very fortunate in the fact that the EU was very open to input throughout the processes, right? When something is being perceived, but also when it is in the making. I think we have to help connect the dots for them if they're not being connected.
Coming from the telco side, we are subject to regulation on cybersecurity in many laws or acts and directives. We find it concerning, but we hope that it will all be solved in the final in the final member states, because that's in the end those who are actually the ones making this into actual regulation. We're not against NIS2. We're just hoping that they're not contradicting each other, and we hope everything will be clear. So we're not having one regulation contradict another, but it is a concern.
It is concerning regarding the question who will be in these expert groups that are supporting the European Commission in all decisions. Really, if they are good people and know the topics and know the problems and know the business, know the sectors that are involved there, it will hopefully work out. If they are too eager and not really, if they don't know what they're doing, they can do great damage by being too detailed. I know from experience, unfortunately, because I've been working about almost 1 year with Article 18, which is reporting the European member states level of security. Elisa is quite eager because this is an opportunity to collect lots of information about the cybersecurity level in the member states. The people who are participating in that working group is, apart from me, we are protesting if the number of items that are being collected, the amount of data that is being collected is too much, because for the member states this is it costs money, it's an expense. So we are actually taking part in some discussions that don't overdo it, because then it'll be too expensive and you'll just hurt yourself. The legislation will not work.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I'm getting conflicting signals here. On the one hand, there are more questions to be discussed. On the other hand, I'm getting signals that we need to conclude and move on to the next session. But there will be an opportunity to discuss also after the next session and also perhaps during the break. So many thanks to all of you who asked questions, and many thanks to our excellent panelists.
I need to interrupt a little bit here. There's me signaling that we do have a limited time anyway. So this is not a surprise anything more, but it's still useful. I start here, and thank you very much for attending. Lise, you definitely need that in the cold Copenhagen. And in Bristol, yes. And you're going skiing, so here you are. Thank you very much. There's a short break now. Hello, everybody. We are entering the last, not the last supper, but last session. And the idea here is that we will continue with this session until 7 o'clock, 7 p.m. That's the English way of saying it. I leave the floor to Sebastian, and he will direct that and keep the time. And after that, you see that there are some food in the back of the room. You are, of course, welcome to dig in afterwards and enjoy everything. Go on.
Thank you very much, and welcome back with a drink. So this session should be fun. I'm also sure you're all getting hungry and keeping time with me. We're talking about DNS abuse in the second session, a really, really important topic that has gained, I think, also politically much more visibility over recent years. And we'll hear three very interesting and somewhat different perspectives. First from ICANN, then from the national gTLD here in Norway, and last not least from IQ Global in terms of how to handle abuse. So, but without further ado, I would welcome Sean Lloyd, who will tell us a little about DNS abuse mitigation in the gTLD context. So we'll hear, I think, a little about the DAR, the Domain Abuse Activity Reporting, as well as some perspectives regarding pandemic-related malicious domain names. And maybe we just give it another second or so until everybody finds his and her seats. Wonderful. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, Oslo. Yeah, so my name's Sean Lloyd. I work in the SSR team within ICANN's Office of the CTO. And as has already been said, I'm going to talk about two projects that we work on that both look at abusive domain names, but in slightly different ways. Okay. So the first project is a fairly long-running project now. It's been running since 2018, and it's called Domain Abuse Activity Reporting, or DAR. And it's really about looking at metrics. So it was designed as a system to look at security threats, to look at domains that have been reported to us as being abusive across top-level domains. And the initial idea was to publish the methodology, to put it out for consultation, to get feedback, and then produce the system that would enable people to replicate it and look at the data that we're looking at and maybe come to different conclusions to the ones that we come to, but actually from the same data, so we thought that would be interesting. This is going to be a very brief overview of it, so there's a link here to where you can find more detail about this work. So in essence, it's a very simple idea. We have the TLD zones, we have the gTLD zones, the generic top-level domains, and we can subscribe to reputation block lists. So some of these are commercial, the likes of Spamhaus, Serval, people you probably have heard of, and some of these are open source data. Things like FishTank and APWG publish a lot of interesting data. And if you combine those, you can look at how abuse is distributed across the TLDs. And because we know the size of the TLDs and we know which domains are actually present in them, we can normalize those figures so we can account for the different sizes of the domains involved. Because obviously a larger zone is likely to have a larger actual number of abuse domains, but the proportions may well be lower. So the idea is that the data can be used to report, it can be used to look at trends and report on historical data and evolution of events and so on. We're not envisaging this data to be used to look at mitigation of these abusive domains. We're not imagining that it can be used to do anything other than what the data contains. So it can't tell us whether domains are malicious registrations or compromised domains, because sometimes we just don't know. It's appeared on one of our feeds, so we can apportion it to whether it's phishing or malware, but we can't tell you any more than that. So we're not inferring more information than is contained within the data that we're consuming. And we're also not looking to rank TLDs. We're not. We'll see some graphs from the reports, but they're all anonymous. We're not labeling which TLD is which, so you can say, well, this one's better than that one. That's not the intention of this system at all. So the system produces monthly reports, and again, the link is on the slide, so you can see these going back in time. We separate the gTLDs into two groups: legacy, which are those delegated pre-2010, and new gTLDs, so all the current batch. And we break down the abuse metrics by those categories. So we've got spam, we've got malware, we've got phishing, and we've got command and control. And you can see how these things differ between the different populations of TLDs. We can look at how things have evolved over the previous 12 months. Literally, if you took a report from 11 months ago, it would have this same thing, but going back the previous 12 months. All of these things, just looking at how things evolve over time. We can also look, of course, per TLD, so we can kind of normalize and plot these things. So here we've got the size of the TLD versus the median count of threat domains that we've seen. And again, the legacy and the new gTLDs are kind of separated, but we're not labeling, we're not telling you which is which. So the monthly reports all have the 12-month graphs, but because we've been collecting this data, we can also look at longer-term reports, longer-term trends, sorry. Things going back a number of years, and the dashed vertical line on these graphs is when the GDPR regulation came into force. Because there was a lot of concern at the time that without WHOIS data, that people wouldn't be able to find and discover abusive domains, and so the problem would either rocket or would disappear completely simply because you're no longer able to discover these things. And from what we saw in our data, there was no kind of discontinuity at this point in time. So we don't think from this, looking at this data, that there was any big change happening at that time. And again, we can break it down by the different categories as well, so we can look at how each of those has evolved over time. We also invite CCTLDs to take part. They have a slightly different report that they receive because it's individualized towards them. It looks something like this, where they get compared to the populations we've seen in the standard monthly reports, and also the other CCTLDs, but not on an individual basis, if that makes sense. So they see their own data, they see the aggregate data of everyone else. They don't see any kind of comparison other than that. They don't see who's who. So this project has been running for a while, and we have a number of things on our to-do list, things that are going to happen, some of which are perhaps more interesting than others to the sort of lay audience, if you like, the people who aren't running a TLD and consuming their own data. So we're looking to add information on uptime of threats. So how long are abusive domains active for before they're mitigated in some way, either suspended from the zone or the malicious content cleared up. We're looking at differentiating between malicious registrations and compromised domains, because those can be seen in very different lights. For instance, the mitigation path that you might take is very different if you think that a registration is malicious compared to if you think it's a legitimate domain that's been hijacked and had malicious content placed on it without the knowledge of the registrant. And a few other things in the pipeline that will hopefully make the information that we can present just more useful, more interesting, more informative, because that's what it's all about. It's about turning data into information to help people make decisions about policy or any other aspect. So that's DAR in a nutshell. Possibly the quickest introduction to DAR I've ever given. The other project I'd like to talk about is, deep breath, Domain Name Security Threat Information Collection and Reporting. Thankfully, DNS ticker for short, or even just ticker, because we can't be bothered. So, yeah, spoiler alert, criminals use the internet, and people use large events, things that are in the public imagination, to be the hook of their campaign, particularly phishing. And if you have a global event that, combined with the internet, you've basically got the largest mass audience for this kind of activity that we've ever seen. So we've known for a while that large events have associated bursts of domain name registrations. So Olympic Games, you get a whole bunch of domains registered with Olympic and the year and the city, or Football World Cup, anything, any event, the larger the event, the more global the event, the larger an effect you see. And COVID-19 was no different, of course, plus the fact that you had people working from home, and it was kind of the perfect storm. And we were seeing articles, we were reading papers, and things were being said about the enormous number of dangerous, of risky, of abusive registrations, domains, URLs, and it wasn't always clear what was meant. It wasn't always clear what people were actually talking about. What do you mean by risky? I don't. It's hard to quantify what was meant. And so yes, words like suspicious, potentially malicious, they're not something you can do anything with. Okay. Some of these were looking at full URLs and reporting the numbers of full URLs, whereas some were looking at certificate transparency lists. Some people were looking at passive DNS sources, just queries within DNS. And so we wanted to have a clear published methodology again that people could reproduce if they wanted to, and examine what exactly we could see within this space, and examine some of the numbers that we were reading. And not only did we want to report on the numbers, but we also wanted to get the right intelligence to the right people. So if people can take action on a domain that is clearly phishing, then getting the right information to them is the way to mitigate that. So it started with COVID-19, and last year we added terms to cover the conflict in Ukraine as well. So the methodology is reasonably simple. Again, we take an input, which is the gTLD zone files that we have access to. And what we do is we take today's zone files and yesterday's zone files, and we look at what's appeared between the two. So those are the new registrations. Okay? That list gets put through a filter, and it's a very simple keyword filter, although we also have translations, we have IDN variants, we have lookalike characters, so we have lots of variations around the themes, like a zero instead of an O, and all that kind of stuff. And if it matches, we take those domains and we look them up against as many threat intelligence sources as we can. So things like VirusTotal, things like PhishTank, things like domain safe browsing APIs. And we gather all the responses from there. And if we see that there's a sufficient number of those sources telling us that these domains are bad, then we take it forward and we gather more information about the domain. We gather the DNS information, so who's hosting it. We capture a screenshot if it's believed that phishing is involved. And then we have a human actually look at the information that we've gathered, looking at the evidence that we've gathered on that domain. And if we believe that it's sufficient to be reported, then we can send a report with all of that auxiliary information that the registrar will need in order to take action by making their own investigation and deciding whether they believe that the domain is malicious or not. So what did we see? Well, on this graph, the blue line is simply the number of registrations that matched one or more of our keywords. Okay, so you can kind of see the same kind of spike that we were seeing in other people's data. We saw a little bit of a bounce, and then things kind of calmed down and returned to some sort of background level. And then there's another little spike when we introduced the terms around the conflict in Ukraine, but nothing like the scale of the spike we saw with COVID. And then the red line on this graph, that's the number of domains where we found at least one piece of information or one source that was telling us that this domain was malicious. Now that's not the same as saying that we believe that it is actually malicious, because some of our sources, they're probabilistic. They're not saying from evidence they've seen that this domain is bad. They're saying that some sort of machine learning algorithm has said that this domain is probably bad. So we can't use all of that information, but it gives you an idea of the difference between just the number that were being registered and the number that had any information at all that they were bad. I'm not going to talk too much about this graph. I've left it in the slide deck. It kind of shows how the different terms evolved over time. I find it interesting. Other people may not. That's fine. And then this is just to say that we had to introduce new terms through the sort of evolution of the event. So here we see the term Omicron, which basically had almost no signal until it was used as a variant of COVID-19, at which point we saw a very sharp spike, basically the event again, but in miniature, okay, over in a matter of weeks rather than months that the initial spike took on. And then some broad statistics just from the first sort of 3 years of operation. We now have around 580 different search terms in our list. We've looked at approaching 500,000 registrations that have matched one or more of our search terms. But only around 6% of those had any evidence, any reports from third parties that they were malicious. And of those 6%, really it's only about 2% that had any level of credible evidence, if you like, at the sort of the level where we might feel comfortable sending that information to a registrar and saying, you may want to spend time looking at this domain because we believe it's malicious. We also obviously were capturing a lot that weren't related to the event. Mask, obviously we had in, based on face mask operatives and people selling PPE and all that kind of stuff. But of course it would also catch anything with those letters in. And again, with payment, we were looking for stimulus payment type phishing, but payment can cover a multitude of different things. So that's it from me. Like I say, two ways of looking at abusive domains in different ways. One looking at broad metrics and aggregating, and one trying to drill down and get specific evidence on individual domains. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. We're going to do the same thing as in the first session, so I'm sure there's quite a few questions to this. So if you would like to raise your hand, and I'll try to remember your face. Questions to Sean? No? I'm very surprised. I have a few. I will get back to them, and maybe you have a few too. Then without further ado, we're going to switch perspectives and go over to the National CCTLD Registry in Norway, where Hilde Thunem is going to talk about there's something we don't like on the internet and the Norwegian approach in the Norwegian legal ecosystem. Hilde has been managing director for more than 20 years now, and you've also been on the CCNSO for even longer, as far as I know, so you're no stranger to the ICANN community. Welcome, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very happy to be here and to talk about the somewhat challenges coming from a CCTLD perspective, because you've recently heard about some of the things that ICANN does. Now, a CCTLD, or a country code, top-level domain, is like .no for Norway, .se for Sweden. We don't talk about them that much, and other things. As someone was saying already, Sean was saying that the bad guys use the internet as well. So it is unfortunately a fact that there are bad things on the internet. So what do we do about that? Well, first I'm going to talk a little bit about why
every CCTLD is different, because we do not do things the same way, and that's because every TLD, whether it's a CCTLD or a gTLD, but it's easier with the CCTLDs, we exist within a legal ecosystem. And that ecosystem is partly made up by local law, in our case Norwegian law, and partly by registration policy, the framework we built on behalf of our community. So for ETNO, there is a registration policy where we require a local presence. We require that anyone having a .no domain name, they don't have to live in Norway, but they do have to be registered either as a business in the Brønnøysundregister, in the business register of Norway, or they have to be registered in the Folkeregister, in the citizen population registry. You can get a number there by working in Norway for a time, so it's not about citizenship, but it's about knowing that it's a real person or a real organization having a domain name. Santa Claus does not get a .no domain name, neither does Mickey Mouse. The other thing is, and this is a sort of very Norwegian thing, we think the ones that come first shouldn't be able to eat all the food at the table, so we need to leave something for someone that comes afterwards. So we have a limit on the number of domain names that each registrant can have. This annoys the spammers. This is nice. But it was not the intention by introducing the rule. It was merely in order for those coming later to the table to have some domain names left. The other principles that are important for us as a registry is that domain names are not magic. And I know I work in an industry where domain names is the most important thing in the world, but they are not magic. And what is illegal offline should also be illegal online. So you can't just say, oh, it's on the internet, then it should be allowed. But vice versa, the rule of law and the principles of justice applies online as well. So the police and others that have a mandate to catch criminals should of course be able to do that online. But they should also have to follow the same procedures of rules. It shouldn't be more difficult for them online, but it shouldn't be easier for them either. What is a domain name? Well, it is not a thing you can touch. It's an address. It's actually a human readable version of an IP address, and it exists in our database the moment somebody comes and subscribes to it. So in a way it's a subscription. It gives you a unique right of use that nobody else can have, as long as you keep up the subscription. So Norway.no can only be held by one company, in this case us, while there are people whose first name is Nurid, and there could be different trademarks within different areas that still share the same name, but they cannot have the same domain name. The other thing that is in the Norwegian law very clear is that the domain holder is responsible for the subscription and the use of it. And this has its background in two different Supreme Court decisions, one from 2009, where the law enforcement went after eZone, that I know, and there was a long court case on, is this actually something that exists in Norwegian law? How do we deal with it? Concluding that it is something that can be seized by the law enforcement, and where the subscriber is responsible. And then in 2019, in Popcorn Time decision, that decided that even if you as a subscriber, or what people like to call registrant of a domain name, if you have rented it out to somebody else, you're still responsible for the use. You may still lose the domain name, you may still have to show up in court. So, when a domain name is used to provide illegal content or services, because that's what we're talking about. I mean, there could conceivably be abusive or illegal domain names like killhilde.right this very moment, don't know. But I mean, usually the domain name itself is not illegal. It does not make an illegal statement. It is whatever use it's put to. And there is a trend that DNS is seen as sort of a way of controlling content, controlling services, trying to act upon the things that run on top of the internet by acting on the infrastructure itself. And this is a quote from the OECD saying that, yeah, this happens. It also has often unintended consequences. Because it's kind of like something illegal is going on in a house, and in order to stop it, instead of going there and stopping the illegal things that are going on, you take down all the road signs and then you make a big hole in the road. And that kind of annoys people that just want to go to the shop next door. So it has unintended consequences. Why do we still sometimes do it? Because sometimes it's the only thing within reach of law enforcement. So sometimes it can be justified, but you have to look at the proportionality of it. So to take one example, we are using, in a brochure we provide to law enforcement, seeing that perhaps a student at the university could have posted something illegal and we were to take down EU.no. That would of course mean that all the email addresses of everyone, including the professors in this room, would stop working, all the web pages would stop working. Last time I checked, the Holocaust Center would also be without its email and services because they depend on the name service from EU.no. Perhaps other services would be down as well, but not possible for us as a registry to see. So with that as background, the Supreme Court still decided domain names can be confiscated. They're a thing. Even if you can't touch them, they are a thing that can be used to commit a crime and so can be confiscated. Like a gun, like a car, like anything you can use to commit a crime, you can also, law enforcement can confiscate it. They can seize it as part of an investigation and then bring it as part of a criminal case that ends up with a confiscation. And what happens is that the right of use is the thing that the domain holder has. It's taken from the domain holder, the registration is transferred to the police, and they are then a domain holder with normal rights and duties, and they have to care for the domain name until the case is finished, just like they have to, feed the dog that they have seized because it bit somebody. It has to exist until the court case is finished. And then, after the case has been decided in court, if there is no clear case for the police, the court will say, this was not used criminally, you have to hand it back. This was the case of the first court case with eZone, where the police did not manage to convince the court that the domain was used in a criminal manner. But if the court then decides, yes, there is enough evidence that this is really criminal, then the domain, the right of use can be confiscated. And then it is given over, the right of use is given over to the state. They can, like with other things they confiscate, if it's stolen bicycles, they hand them back to the people they were stolen from. If they can't reach the people they were stolen from, they sell it, and the money goes to the state. So you could sell a domain name for money for the state, or they can keep it if they want to. They can also destroy it, which is what they do when they confiscate drugs. They do not sell it. So that is a choice of the state after winning the case of law enforcement. In the case of Popcorn Time, law enforcement decided to keep the domain name for a while. What we as a registry do is mainly to say, if a domain is confiscated and the police want to destroy the registration, and they tell us, we will voluntarily block the domain name for 2 years, and that is mainly to avoid a new customer buying something that has been used in a criminal manner. It's the same when you get a telephone number. Nobody wants the telephone number that belonged to the Pizza Express. So you need a cool down period. But that is the only thing, and then it goes back into the ordinary resource that everybody can use. Then we do have, in addition to the police that can do this, and is given clearance in law to seize a thing without a court case beforehand, we have the Consumer Protection Regulation. So there are, I think, 9 different authorities that have been given the power to, when there is a risk of serious harm to the interest of consumers, and there is no other way of stopping it, to go to court and tell them we need this domain name to be taken down, or we need it transferred to us as an authority. And this comes from the EU base of a regulation that basically highlights the proportionality issue, that taking down a domain name is very, very serious because it can have unintended consequences. So it should only be done after everything else has been tried. And in Norway, this is implemented differently in different countries, but in Norway the Norwegian government also said, because it is so serious, even the Consumer Protection Authority have to go to court and show them that they have tried everything else before they go to the registry. It's the court that decides that a domain name should be taken down, with the exception of the Norwegian Medicine Agency, because in those cases where with bad medicines there can be lives on the line, so they have the right to come directly to us. So what do we do? Well, what we don't do is to decide on whether things are legal or illegal. I mean, there's lots of governmental agencies that have that power, and we as a registry do not have that competence, nor do we have the mandate. The Supreme Court, it looks like we were part of that case, but we weren't. We were just, sitting on the sidelines and watching, but the Supreme Court took the time to make it very, very clear that NORID does not undertake any control of the content of websites and do not have a mandate. And this is something that we have also found support from law enforcement in, because it's their job, it's not our job. What we do is to try to make it possible for those who have that mandate to carry it out in a transparent manner, in a good manner that means that every party understands what's going on. And then we also provide a lot of information. So we do provide, you can't see it here, but we do provide different guides to people on domain conflicts in the legal system, both what happens with court cases, what happens with the domain dispute resolution things, what happens with criminal things, and guides for law enforcement if you want to seize a domain name. This is what you need to tell us in order for us to actually be able to carry out the power that you have been given. And then we also have a WHOIS, or rather, it's actually soon running RDAP underneath, so that's another technology. But basically we have a web page where you can go and you can look up who holds a domain name. If it's a company like us, you'll get a lot of information. You won't get the information of who is the contact person for the domain, but in this case I think you can guess. If it's a private person, you will just get an email address that you can contact that individual on, and you will get some information about the registrant and all this, but the registrar, but you will not get information about the domain holder unless you have, power in law or other reasons that we can hand that information to you. So that is basically what we as a registry do. If you want to read more than you ever wanted to know about things in Norway, we have the guides, we have the routines and procedures, we have translated the Supreme Court decisions, and there's a couple of other documents as well that's nice to read. The OECD report provides a fairly good description on the ecosystem of DNS that's much wider than what I'm able to touch on here. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Lise, for this presentation on the local CCTLD. Again, I would ask whether we have questions in the room. Then please raise your hand and I'll try to remember your face. You're all waiting for the drinks and the food? I have a few questions again, so I look forward to asking them. So we definitely will stay on this panel until 7 o'clock. So we're not asking us questions. You're not getting away. Promise. Last but not least, we have with us Rolf Larsen, the chairman of IQ, who will present to us IQ Abuse Manager, a service that monitors 200 million domain names on a daily basis, which is quite a lot. So I'm looking forward to hear more about that. Rolf.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for being here. My name is Rolf Larsen, and I've been in this space for a while. Our company, IQ Global, is a company that has been operating in the industry for a number of years, and I want to talk about, why is a small Norwegian company one of the leading, or perhaps the leading provider of services in the DNS abuse monitoring and management. And that is a part of our history, I guess, which goes 30 years back. 30 years ago, we started one of the absolutely first commercial ISPs in Norway. Norway was also one of the first countries in Europe that came online on internet. And actually, Steinar and myself, we programmed most of the routers and the servers that was sent all around in Norway. So we actually became the first fully national ISP, actually before Telenor, the incumbent telco, became. Obviously, it was very expensive to operate these things, so eventually we sold this company to another telco, which was Telia. But in that company, which started in the absolute beginning of the 90s, we dealt with domain names, domain registrations, which most of it happens by fax machines back then. There was very little things that happened online. Yeah, we did everything that companies do today, but across multiple sectors. So we did everything from shared hosting, dedicated hosting, co-location, ISP for consumers, for businesses, everything from firewall operations to whatever was needed back then, because we were a part of the few handfuls in Norway that dealt with internet back then. So at least we were real geeks, perhaps hopefully not so much anymore, but we were really hands-on. After that company, which takes us to the more to the end of the 90s, or close to the end of the 90s, we established another company that became the first pan-European web hosting company. It was more into shared hosting, and was also one of the, say, 10 biggest in the world back then. We operated in 15 countries, and I guess we were the one that registered domain names across most countries, before ASCII and the current providers of that. So we learned in the hard way, I guess, the hard way about how abuse was done in various countries, and how to deal with it. We had to create our own legal department that dealt with these things, and we had to create systems for it. So fast forwarding a little bit, because we had multiple companies between then and later on, where we helped several registries with their operations as consultants. But we also operated our own registry for a while, .global, for those who know that, which we sold back in 2019. And after that, we switched completely to offering those tools that we actually built for .global in this space of abuse mitigation. And then I guess the reason why we built it was one of our providers, they stopped providing their service. Instead of finding another, we started to build it and then offer it to others. So that is the background for why. Currently we are helping companies from the biggest players in the industry down to the smallest ones, being registrars or registries or software service providers or others that need to deal with domain-related abuse. Regarding trends, I mean, we concur with Dar. It's the trends have improved a little bit lately. It's still a big problem. There are certain aspects about reporting of abuse. there are not really a lot of good tools for that, so we don't see all the abuse. And so not all the abuse will be in all these different, say, block lists that DAR uses and we use. So there's still a problem out there regarding reporting. I have to put some emphasis on that. DAR operates and checks a certain amount of domain names. There are obviously many more domain names than this in the world, and as well as DAR, we work to gather information about all of them and work on that. So I'll get a little bit back to what or how we deal with it. We also give up some statistics and tools, and we recently gave up some reports. And one of every 368 domain names out there has some associated abuse with it. Almost all TLDs out there has abuse reports connected to it. So it is a problem everywhere across all operators. And phishing and spam is what we see most of in terms of amount of reports. I guess the time that we have operated, we have gathered about 40 million reports, abuse reports. So we have a lot of data. I guess we get about between 40 and 50,000 every day. So there's that. Also, I have to talk a little bit about the different feeds or block lists that is available to us and to DAR and others. Many of them have been built for different purposes even than what we use it for. Many have been built for restricting access through ISPs or to email. So to block email, and therefore many of these quite large data feeds are not say current information, and that's also something that the industry needs to take in and perhaps improve on. So we don't have perfect data, but there's a lot of data out there. So why should the players in the industry deal with abuse? I mean, we think it's very important for a namespace to have a good reputation. Obviously, those who use the namespace, they will be affected by a lot of abuse in that same namespace. So we can see that on certain namespaces are perhaps doesn't have that good reputation, and that is actually affecting the registrations and the seriousness of the players using the namespace. So it is something that everyone should care for, and also care for being a part of this global initiative to deal with abuse. Where I have to say that for me, surprisingly large amount of players in the industry have taken part in this, which is very positive. I didn't expect that when the industry started to really focus on this. It's gone quite fast, and I feel that everyone's so positive and easy to work with regarding this. For what we provide several different tools. One of them is free, so that is the abuse stats or abuse statistics. There's some place that everyone can go in and get statistical reports and provide information about what they want. It can be for TLD, for name server, or for any subject that they want to receive reports on. So here, all the players in the industry actually have a source to see statistics, not full insight, but statistics. So that's true. Then the main product that we offer is a product that is used to manage abuse. So it's a case management tool. So not only does it give full insight into the abuse, we of course dig out all the information we can about any reported abuse. We make sure to provide that information to the case manager so that they can easily make choices to what to do. We have all those data feeds that DAR uses, but we have also many more. We have a curated list of data feeds that we provide and can be selected as the registry or registrar or whoever use the service option into. But for us, we have curated them in a way to provide less false positives, because obviously when you deal with these things, you can very quickly go in and get a lot of false positives. So that's what we do in order to make sure that the case manager knows that this is a real thing to deal with, and of course categorize it and provide our metrics on it to make it easy. The service also makes it easy to communicate between the players in the industry, because registries need to communicate to registrars and vice versa. And here, instead of sharing, say, spreadsheets, you can share a magic link that contains all the relevant information, so that it makes it very easy for the various players to deal with that information when it's shared. Obviously also have ways to report abuse and report to the stakeholders like ICANN and national requirements where there are a need to provide specialized reports, maybe like for Spec 11.3b for the new TLDs and the registrars 318 in the registrar agreement. We provide those reports that are tailored to those requirements that is needed. And this tool we will of course make sure that helps the industry, whatever part of industry you're part of, to make sure that we can also stay compliant with NIS2. So we talked about the complexity of having all these regulations and all these things, and then you need tools, much like we have here, or other tools that exist in the industry, to make sure that you stay compliant and can deal with the cases in the best possible way. Other things that I can say about the service is that it also contains, I would say, areas that are really important. For those players who want to also monitor CSAM, we have a agreement with World Force Foundation. So we actually are one, I think we're the first player that can do this for the industry. This is obviously a very serious topic and something that the industry really need to start to help with. So I guess that's what I can say about abuse management. I probably could say much more. We also have a more sort of entry tool that gives abuse reports. It's called Abuse Scan. And for this tool, it's more so paper use. You can enter whatever you want to monitor. It can be monitoring an IP address, or monitoring a DNS server, or monitor a list of domain names. So brands can use this, registries, registrars, anyone. can use this sort of an ad hoc way to get more insight than just statistics, which is our free service. So this is sort of an add-on product that we have. And then we are working on something new, something we started last year to build. We are working on a domain blocking tool. So one thing is that, you know, after abuse happens, we deal with it. But what if we could prevent much abuse from happening in the first place? And this is a difficult thing to make, because obviously registries and registrars, they don't want to block revenue. At least certainly those that are commercial, but even the non-commercial, you know, they don't want to block the namespace, because, you know, it should be available namespace. And for us to build this block list based on all this historic abuse data that we have, to make sure that we provide a block list that only contains non-legit domain names, and domain names that are extremely likely to be abusive towards the label or the brand in this case, because brand names are, you know, one of those things that are really used to lure people out on the internet and for phishing and for many things. So this way is one way to help brands to protect themselves better, but protect themselves in a cost-efficient way that doesn't hurt the industry, you know, the providers, so the registrars and the registrars, but in the opposite way, you know, it provides revenue for that industry when the brand players decide to use services like this to block abuse from happening. Obviously, we cannot, you know, block all kinds of situations, so there will always be holes here and there. But it is important to make sure that you have a way to reduce abuse from happening in the first place. And this is what we're building. This creates a list to block. So blocking domain names means that it cannot be registered. If a blocked domain is already registered, meaning a domain name that we wish to be blocked is already registered, it won't affect that domain name unless it expires. It will then end up with this block list, and you cannot re-register that domain name. The algorithm and the service that we have built, launching very soon actually, provides more than just the block list. So it also provides a list to this brand operator that contains all the domain names that we found during the algorithm that actually are, say, legit and perhaps valuable names that they should consider. In addition, we also provide a list of taken domains that we found during the algorithm, because algorithm go to tens of thousands of domain name variations that they should have a look at, because there could be actual abuse happening there. We will couple this with our abuse manager as well, so we will give more information on those. And there could be domain names that they should, say, acquire on that list, or go after, or disputes that they should launch. So that's the latest thing that we are working on. So the initiatives really to make internet safer is what we are about. I guess we are more of a proponent of stricter rules than lesser rules, but that's everyone has different legislations and rules connected to them, and obviously we just try to make sure that everyone can live up to their duties.
Thank you very much, Rolf. And with that, let's thank Rolf for the presentation. I would ask John and Hilde to join me again, Rolf, you as well on the panel. Thanks for 3 very interesting perspectives on DNS abuse. We had a question in the audience, at least one. So if we could get a microphone to Lee in the second row. Or you take mine in the meantime, and please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Sebastian. Lee Bygrave, NRCCL, University of Oslo. Thank you, the 3 of you, for excellent presentations. I learned a lot. I have a couple of questions, or maybe 1.5 questions. The first question relates to certain states that will not be named. I would have assumed that with cyber conflict, there is going to be a DNS abuse facet going on. But is it very obvious? You said Sean, that you're not revealing particular players or parties, but does one see any evidence of certain states that should not be named engaging in systematic DNS abuse, or, for example, IQ?
So I can address what we see in our data. When we added terms around the conflict in Ukraine, it's important to remember we don't have access to ccTLDs. So we're just looking in the gTLD pool for these. And we also don't see the actors behind the actions that we're seeing, if that makes sense. So we're not drilling into the owners or the registrants of the domain, if you like. So our data doesn't show these things going on. We hear about it anecdotally, but we don't have any data to make a call on it one way or the other.
We monitor both ccTLDs and the gTLDs and obviously all trends, if it's COVID or anything else in the past, we see it. We see that there are trends on the terms in this area too. But I personally have no sort of insight on to give any detail answer on it, other than that we have seen the rise of it, and that it is a trend that is probably quite.
And for .no?
No, we haven't seen anything like that. Not that we monitor about content, but if it had been very clear, I would expect either Norwegian authorities to have discovered it or it to be discovered by the press. So I think also to be clear that sometimes when things happen, people register domain names that have that term, and it has nothing to do with abuse. It has to do with this is the moment, that this is what you're thinking about at the time. You're thinking about COVID, or you're thinking about working at your home office, or you're thinking about war, and you're thinking perhaps I should make a page for relief for refugees from Ukraine, perhaps I should register something that has. So for a term to rise doesn't really necessarily connect with criminals doing abuse, which again doesn't necessarily connect with state actors. That does quite different things than just registering a web page, I would assume.
So it's another example of the problem of attribution.
Yeah.
Yeah, once it exists in abuse reports, that's when you really see it.
Yeah. And then my second question is sort of related to Hilde. You didn't really give an indication as to whether NORID is engaging in the sort of activity that IQ is engaging in, or
definitely not.
Definitely
We have no mandate to work
so.
on content. So going and monitoring what the subscribers does is not something that we have a mandate for. We have also, it's about, privacy and freedom of speech is pretty well regulated in Norway, which means that it would be law enforcement and others to do investigations. We come into it when they come and either seize a domain name or request information based on their power in law, and we hand over information provided they have the power in law. Sometimes they want action to seize the domain name and take it down immediately. Sometimes they might want to observe what happens, and that is their work. We just act on it when it is appropriate, given that they come with an order. It would not be a court order in case of law enforcement, but it would still be a clear legal order.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really interesting question. More questions in the floor? We have time for one more. And otherwise, I would try to boil down many of my questions to the three of you and try to connect them into one. And it connects a little to where Lee just stopped, so bear with me. Soon there will be food. Hilde, you said, what is a domain name? And explained that to us, and I think that's great and very important. I'm not so sure what is abuse. And we heard a lot about abuse now, right? So we know malware, botnets, phishing, farming, spam, and so on. We also know that phishing and spam are most prevalent categories, and so on. And we also know that NORID, due to also the legal setup as a CCTLD, is not very proactive in these things. Now, and as a background, I was involved in advising the European Commission on the Digital Services Act. What I kind of am seeing is that there is definitely kind of an encouragement to do more about illegal things happening online, mainly directed to platforms, completely different players. But now in the DSA, there is a clause that I think also addresses DNS actors to voluntarily maybe do more than you're required to do. And that is obviously an interesting and slippery slope, because then we're talking about content. We're not talking about waiting for the courts to come with an order, but actually out of self good Samaritan actions. Any thoughts on, so what is it we're talking about DNS abuse? Where's the border between use of the DNS and the content that is being made accessible via domain name?
I think DNS abuse is one of the most abused terms I know of. It goes from, in some settings, meaning technical attacks on the DNS. A DDoS attack on our name servers could be seen as abuse of the DNS. They're attacking the basic service we're all. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about mainly, most of it, what we would term technical abuse, although that's a slippery slope, in phishing, in botnets being controlled by certain domain names, in spam, except that spam is kind of content. It's not that much difference between spam and a web page. And then we're into content where you start with the easy part, with easy, that everybody agrees on is illegal, which is images of child abuse, and you move on to IP rights being abused, you move on to women in Iran taking pictures of themselves not wearing a headdress, which is illegal in some countries, but not here.
It's really abusive use of the domain names. You know, that's and that goes for many things that is the domain is used for. You know, not the DNS itself. You know, it's. Yeah.
So talking about the slippery slope here and the DSA, I think for us we would take guidance from our local government. And our local government has, when considering the consumer protection regulation, said taking down the domain name is so invasive that it should be done through an authority making a case in front of a court, mostly, with one exception. So us as a private actor then saying, but yeah, we are the superhero of the internet, we decide that we can take it down. The Consumer Protection Authority has to go to court, but we can do it. It's not something I see us doing. I think, given the framework in Norway, I'm not saying that that would fit every gTLD, because they do not have the same clear jurisdiction. But for us, the processes, the rule of law, and the consistency in who does what is very, very important. Because we think we will undermine the trust in the democratic system, to use the big words, but this is about us not having a mandate to step in because there is a democratic balance.
Yeah, obviously what you say is correct, and is correct for Norway and correct for you, but But there is also something to be said about registries that create stricter policies, that clear policies, that they maintain. So you know, for the gTLDs, for example, that is the case. You know, they have policies that they maintain. They don't have, you know, they can turn to the police to, you know, can you please check these things? You know, like the industry will notice that there's big, serious problems, and where the industry can, under their policies, there's probably should do something about it. But it's under their policies, and their policies for are not the same as policy for other two.
I think that's a very important reflection, right? That the framework is actually quite different in this respect, and there's different things to take account of. Sean, any perspective from ICANN? Now also that you work with this data, right? I mean, is that a call to action to do more proactively?
So we have very similar issues that we have to be mindful of where our scope ends and what's within scope and what isn't. So we can't look at sites selling counterfeit goods, for example, because that's outside of our remit. And things like phishing and malware distribution are within our remit, so we're quite able to go in and you know, look at those and report them if we see fit. But we have to be careful not to extend that at all.
Thank you very much, and I have to be very careful of time. So what I would do is, yes. Oh, you have a question. Well, since I give the word back to you in a few seconds, you are very welcome to ask a question.
For the audience, I think I'd like to mention something of that. Something that was referred to by Rolf and Sian here is that there is something called Spec 11 3B, and that is passes in the registry agreement for the new generic TLDs. This was entered into the process of developing the policies for creating the new TLDs, and it was some sort of I don't like the word force, but maybe it was more triggered by the Governmental Advisory Committee because they saw something in this space saying that we have to do something about suspicious behavior on the internet when the new TLDs rise to the surface and get into the root. In the beginning, and I do agree, we have had serious problem defining what is DNS abuse. There's libraries of explanations and thinking about that, etc., etc. The good thing here is that those who we refer to as the contractual parties within the ICANN environment, within the generic environment, they have kind of agreed upon what is this. They have set some sort of a level. They have also seen that in the original text, as it is today, spam is not being referred to, but they have added spam when it's a vehicle for something that is worse. It's something that driven something into this. And the good thing also with my day job hat on, is that the contracted parties has agreed upon to saying that the wording in these Spec 11 3B and 318 for the registry accreditation agreement is not good enough. They have made consensus to make this better, and that is something that with my at-large hat, oh my God, I have hats here, is that something that at-large kind of would like to advocate, because we see that we have to deal with something, because if we don't deal with it, we will kind of saw the branch we're sitting on the tree. We have to be trustworthy. So end of story is, yes, the CCTLDs do have different tools than the generics, and that's okay. That's okay. What I really like to hope is that everybody takes a small portion of solving and mitigate these kind of problems, because we are all depending on having a trustworthy and safe namespace. Thank you very much. And now we will very soon go to the dinner.
Wonderful. So apparently there is still a lot to discuss. I think there's a possibility to discuss again in around mid-November here at the Internet Forum as well. Maybe also before. Thanks again to our three presenters and panelists for a really interesting discussion. And without further ado, I think I would go back to you, Steiner, right? But first of all, big applause. Thank you very much.
And again, this is not a surprise anymore. But it will be something to bring back home and say, at least I got something doing this. I'm missing one, I guess. Or did I? No, I'm missing. Yeah, I take that as I knew. Anyway, sorry for miscalculating here. What happened to the? Yeah, well, anyway, I found out. The thing is now we have some food, we have some drinks, we have the meeting room until 9 p.m. So be polite, talk to friends, not start fighting, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.